So, welcome to Kinship Cafe. I'm your host, Jim Jones. So glad that you all could join us today. And we are going to continue with chapter 10 of the Daodejing. And let me bring up my screen here. There we go.
There you go.
All right. Back in business. So, yeah, chapter 10, a little bit long. It's had a lot of interesting aspects to it. So we spent the last couple of weeks talking about it already. We'll continue on with that. But one of the just kind of refreshing, one of the key challenges when you move into any kind of like different philosophical or religious position that's not the standard for the larger cultural context you live in is, how do you balance the two worlds? How do you balance what you're trying to cultivate in yourself versus, the surroundings that you find yourself in? And so chapter 10 is definitely dealing with this question of self-cultivation, but it's also asking these questions about how do you maintain these different ways of being in the world while you are, trying to negotiate these two different ways of being. So this issue of self-cultivation is going to come up, and what we talked about previously was mindfulness and how that process works. We spent some time talking about meditation and so forth. And then last week, we also spent some time diving deep into some cultural context to get some better insights into what did they mean exactly by something like spirit and how they broke it down into 5 different kinds, as well as this concept of chi, which we're going to talk about today. But then the other areas that are of primary importance when we're thinking about self-cultivation for the Taoist is going to be this idea of spontaneity, or this idea of natural spontaneity. So we've explored the concepts of wu wei in the past, which would literally be translated as not doing, and then the even more fun term wei wu wei, which is doing not doing, and how these play out in terms of recognizing the distinction between culturally constructed ways of expected behavior, whether this is certain types of uh, ritual or protocol that one's expected to do, that they would really challenge, because they think that this is sometimes bringing on a different way of looking at the world, or trying to be in the world that's not exactly natural. And because of that, it creates conflict. One of the other key components we've been looking at is the necessity for understanding flow to keep things moving, that everything's in constant change and flux. And so bringing about this idea of spontaneity within the human is kind of underlying concept that there is at a human nature level, there's a number of things that are positive in terms of how we interact with the world, that it generates a natural compassion, a natural concern for things, for others, that gets lost or diminished when different cultural concerns start to build up and drive us in different directions, or cause us to be more in competition with each other. So this would be one of the key things they're trying to get at, is how do we get back to kind of that more basic, inborn, natural spontaneity. And then there's also the idea of cultivated spontaneity. And here, probably the biggest thing is figuring out how to get beyond what would be, from a natural perspective, our self-centered perspective. So we see the world always from our own eyeballs, right? And so it kind of, just by the nature of existing, we always see the world as though we are at the center of everything. We learn as we get older, oh, there's a person across the room. They actually have a perspective. They're looking at me, and they're seeing things different than the way I'm seeing things. I'm actually in their picture, right? And as we start to recognize that there's these multiple ways of existing in the world, then we're able to um, get beyond just our own perspective in terms of that this is not the only perspective that's out there, but then we also have to look at the fact that we're part of this larger whole, which was a big part of what we looked at when we first started this chapter, is how do we maintain the idea that, yes, I'm a self, but I'm a self that's embedded inside a larger whole. And how do we balance those two things? How do we keep those things in balance? And part of that is getting beyond this idea that I am at the center of everything. I'm still a self, but I'm a self that's part of a larger whole. So that's kind of some basic recap here. That first part of chapter 10, that's the part we were just talking about, is can you balance your life force? And recall that this is the Chinese character Po, which has to do with kind of more of the five different spirits that define the person, the one that's considered, in a sense, kind of like that animal spirit, the one that's more in the present moment, that's a part of the present experience without all of the other speculating about the future or concerns about the past. It also is the yin side as opposed to the yang side of the yin yang that becomes important in terms of how we're thinking about the connection of where things are out of balance. If the basic Taoist position is correct, that there's an overextension of the yang, then they're trying to reassert the yin, and this is part of what they're trying to bring out in this initial line. But then the question of, can we understand that connection to the whole and do that without developing this concept of a separation? So the next part of this, then, where we're going to start today, is, can you control your breath? And this word breath is actually, again, the Chinese character qi. It says, can you control your qi gently like a baby? So here we've got some interesting concepts that are coming into play. We've got the idea of controlling your qi, and it's translated here as breath. And so when we talked about how qi is used, it's kind of an interesting concept that makes up essentially everything that is. It's very similar to the concept of wu that we saw when we were looking at the contrast between wu and yu, the idea of without form and with form, but how it's all one thing. It's just kind of different manifestations of it. Qi is kind of used in a similar way, and it's often talked about in terms of flow as well, because everything is in constant motion, and it's also associated with breath and wind and a number of different things. It's a very common kind of character used in a lot of different ways. But here, I think what was getting at is, in a lot of different self-cultivation or meditative or mindfulness practices, will sometimes have different breathing techniques that they're trying to develop, either to control your breathing in a certain way or just simply paying attention to your breath. Don't know exactly what the particular practices would have been at this time, but here there definitely is either this idea of noticing or regulating breath in such a way that it's helping them to get to be what they said, like a baby. Other ones are talking about, translations will talk about becoming like an infant. And I think that the core of what they're trying to get at here is that when we're thinking about a baby or an infant, we're looking at a human life that has yet to be enculturated. It hasn't received all of the different cultural trainings about all the shoulds and shouldn'ts that you're supposed to do. It just simply is responding naturally and spontaneously to the different stimulus that happens. And this becomes a bit of an ideal within then that Taoist tradition, not in the sense of, we want to be immature, but in the sense that we are trying to get to a point of being at that natural state, unspoiled or unstained by that cultural noise of, the value system or the morality or the, all the shoulds and shouldn'ts, but we're just acting the way that we're kind of that human nature, that first nature, how we're supposed to be in the world. Maybe pause there for a second and see if you guys have any thoughts or questions about that.
I find it interesting that this would be the goal, the ideal, where I feel that because this is more like a cop out. You know what? I'm just gonna do whatever feels okay, whatever is the natural way of doing it, without consequences, without implications, without any ownership of your own actions and such.
Mm-hmm.
And while I think we've said it before that obviously the social norms, social expectations uh, could have a negative impact. I think they also could have a very positive impact. I think it's important for us to kind of take advantage of our capabilities of the social constructs and the social responsibilities of those um, concepts and use them for the actual good, not just ignore them. It's like, with great power comes with great responsibility. It's I think there's just more that we need to be doing and using our privilege of being sentient beings and being conscious beings and having abstract thinking
Mm-hmm.
to benefit others.
Yeah, and I think this is definitely one of the criticisms that will sometimes come in about Taoism is it seems to be kind of like this quietist and kind of a withdrawal almost. But at the same time, there's clearly this idea of a cultivated spontaneity, and maybe we can kind of flesh this out a bit because this is where we're attempting to take on a second nature, where there's something that we're trying to develop. So, right off the bat, there's this idea of moving from a self centered perspective, which, if we're thinking about naturalness, that's definitely kind of the natural position that the baby is born with, and something that we all wrestle with is that everything, I appear to be at the center of everything. So, getting beyond that is not part of this natural spontaneity, right? It's we are working to develop a different kind of character where we see ourselves differently. And if we get to the point where we've really incorporated that in ourselves, truly cultivated it, then it becomes like second nature. So if we think about other types of tasks, maybe something more simple like how I type on the keyboard, if you stop and ask me where's a particular key on the keyboard, I'm going to have to really stop and think about it and look to see where it is. But if I'm typing, I don't have to think about it. So my fingers just do what they need to do. It's kind of become second nature. This is the kind of effortless spontaneity that they're also looking for, but it's cultivated, right? So driving a car, we don't when we're learning it, it's kind of a clumsy process because we're trying to understand all the different moving parts and things that are happening simultaneously. But once we've got that down, then it becomes kind of this effortless thing that when our kids get old and we have to try and teach them how to drive, all of a sudden we got to think about what we're doing, and it's not so easy to kind of understand it. And that's where we're looking at like the second nature, but in terms of different types of virtues or character that they also want to develop. So yes, there's definitely that aspect, Martin, where they want to bring those pieces into it. But there's I think here the emphasis on the idea of the infant is recognizing that there's kind of a natural state that contains a lot of these valuable, let's say, kind of ethical positions about self-concern and concern of others that is just kind of naturally there that can get lost. And so there's a recovery of what is that kind of inborn nature and how do we return to that, recognizing these layers that have been added by culture or community or tradition. And then like the moral questions where morality tends to be more and we'll talk about this a little bit further down, but it's presented in such a way as though it's a given, even though it's actually arbitrary, that it's been chosen by a community. And so by claiming it to be kind of like an objective truth that somebody should be doing this, we lose that capacity to understand the arbitrariness of it. And so if we can focus on trying to get back to that initial kind of human nature or spontaneity that they're talking about, then when we're looking at adding on these other forms of cultivated spontaneity, we're doing it with the awareness that we're intentionally adding it, that it's not necessarily a given, but it's a choice. The distinction there is when we recognize the arbitrariness of these things, is it leaves them open to questioning, to revision, to updating. And it's when we lose that objectivity of the fact that these secondary things that are added are not objective aspects of reality, but something we have specifically chosen, that we get ourselves into trouble. And I know it's a little bit of a kind of a complicated sorting out these different aspects of our existence, but I think it's really one of the key things that the Taoists are trying to get at, because clearly they're calling us to a particular way of being in the world. So they are arguing to adopt a perspective, right?
Jim, is there any, I'm having a hard time following. Is there any way you can clarify or give another example? The effortless spontaneity versus the cultivated. I'm having a hard time. Do you have another example?
Sure. So one of the examples that is brought up by the Taoist and used by others as well. Well, actually, I can't remember. I think the first person that I think I came across this was Mencius, who was kind of a later development of Confucian thinking, but it's all within the kind of this classical Chinese period. But he talks about, if you're walking along the road and you see somebody's child that's at the edge of a well, and you don't even know who they are, you don't know the parents, you don't know the kid, but you see them fall, you're going to just run over and try and help that baby. It doesn't matter if you know them, you're not giving any conscious thought to it. It's just a spontaneous act of compassion and concern for the other that is just built in. Right? This would be what they would argue is that natural spontaneity that has that compassion and that concern and that empathy for others that can get muted based off of different requirements within society that can make us more distant from each other and fail to experience that more natural, spontaneous compassion and empathy for others. So that would be more like the infant state, right? Trying to get back to how do we just feel that natural thing. You don't have to work it up. You don't have to develop it. It's just there. It just happens. That would be the kind of the natural spontaneity. The cultivated spontaneity would be things that aren't necessarily part of that natural state, but we have deemed them valuable. And if we incorporate them to such a degree that it becomes second nature, so like driving a car or typing, these are more physical things, but we can sometimes it's easier to think about how that just becomes a way of being, a way of doing things without having to think. I don't have to think about how to type when I need to type. It just spontaneously happens as I'm working on something. So this would be more of a cultivated spontaneity. But you can also think about this in terms of, character traits, right? So if I've developed a character trait where I default to assuming the best about someone's intentions as opposed to defaulting to assuming the worst, then I don't have to work it up when somebody cuts me off in traffic to like, okay, let me think about this differently. Let me think about it as maybe they just didn't see me, or maybe they just got to go somewhere, and I got to overcome this initial anger I had by reframing what's going on. The second nature, I wouldn't have to do any of that because that's kind of my default mode already. I'm just like, somebody cut me off and I'm already just perceiving this as, oh, they must not have seen me, or, something like that. That would be like the cultivated spontaneity. Does that help?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So it is an interesting thing. Sometimes the Taoists are presented as just, going back to getting rid of all knowledge and, just going back to, this kind of simple natural state, because they seem to have this concern about words and meanings. But really, I think the reason they bring that up is so that we're aware of the possibility that they're wrong, that the values that we've adopted could be incorrect. And it's not that we are trying to get to a valueless way of being, because everything we do is based off of some kind of goal, something that we value. Their move within the Taoist tradition is, how do we cultivate better values, better goals? It's not about not having desire, it's about how do we desire rightly. And that means that there's a thought process that's going into play here about why this way of being is better than this way of being. But by keeping it open to recognizing that we're choosing this way, not that it's just objectively that way, then we have the ability to continually revise it and update it as new information comes in, and we can stay more, have a clearer perspective of reality and how we're enacting. And really, I guess that's kind of the thing, is it's trying to make sure that we understand that these layers that we're adding on top, the cultural stuff, the language stuff, that this is not the actual reality. It's on top of the actual reality. We need to be able to see the actual reality clearly so that we can continue to evaluate the things that we're adding on top. Does that make sense?
Yes, I'm a little cross-eyed, but I think I'm following.
If there's one of the things that I can describe this Taoism in one go, it's not a one thing. It's not a one idea. It is all the things almost at once everywhere.
Like the movie.
Like the movie, yeah.
Yeah. So it gets a little easier to kind of track with it as you stick with it and kind of, continue to wrestle with the ideas. And this is where that mindfulness part comes in too, right? So if we've got this time in the morning before we start our day, when we're just reflecting on ourselves and our world and our place in it, and we start to wrestle with some of these ideas and what are we trying to develop in ourselves, like who do we want to be, then the different layers start to make a little bit more sense, because we can see how they're interacting in terms of, how am I viewing the world on a day-to-day basis? Why am I responding to things the way I'm responding? And is that actually how I want to respond? So it's not you just hear it and you've got it. There's, in the modern parlance, what do they say? It's about doing the work. There's this process that you have to engage in terms of self-cultivation. It's not just something that happens. So let's continue then with our discussion here. So here we kind of talked about the different aspects, Qi being breath, infant, spontaneous, prior to acquiring, cultural norms. I guess I could have switched to the next page here. Forgot about this one. So the next section then is, can you clarify your dark vision without blemish? So, number of things that are happening here. Remember that dark within our Taoist framework is not a negative thing. It is, again, bringing to mind the yin aspect of the yin yang. So there's this constant reassertion of the yin that's coming up within the Taoist tradition. I think I have a different version of this translation here. Yeah. So I just brought in another translation I thought brought some interesting dimensions to this. It says, in cleaning away the worldly view, can you be without imperfections? So if we think about the stuff that we pick up from culture that they're wanting to be concerned about, in terms of recognizing that these are arbitrary rather than objective, here we've got this idea of cleaning away those worldly, or we could say cultural views. Can we be without imperfections? Now, one of the things that's not being brought out in either of these translations, and it is in some of the others, is that this vision or view, as it is in the next one, is actually the character for mirror. So it's talking about this dark mirror. Can you clarify your dark mirror without blemish? In cleaning away your worldly mirror or dark mirror, can you be without imperfections? Can the mirror be without imperfections? So let's break this down a little bit. So we've got this idea of dark mirror. So what is the mirror doing? The mirror is a reflection. So when they're talking about cleaning it, it's, you know, is there anything that's stopping the reflection from working properly? Like, is there a smudge on it? Is there part of it that's like covered? If it is, it's not going to properly reflect. So if we're trying to get at this natural spontaneity way of being in the world, there's almost kind of like this natural reflection of the world in who we are. If we're becoming more natural, then what's happening in the natural world should be reflected in the way that we do things. And this is the way we sometimes talk about stuff, right? We talk about, are they reflecting something? We don't necessarily say a mirror, but it's bringing up that same kind of a concept. By implying dark mirror, then there's an aspect of this reflection that's trying to be brought about. So we're seeing, hopefully clearly, where our perception is clear about the natural world. This is a part of, you know, taking off all those filters. But then how are we reflecting it? And here we've got this yin yang possibilities again. And if it was more yang, then we might be seeing the natural world, but we then might be trying to work on, how do we control this? How do we manage this? How do we use it to our advantage? Or how do we engage in conflict or something along those lines? Whereas by asserting more of the yin aspect, when we were talking about the soul questions, the 5 different souls or spirits, the yin aspect was more about accepting newness, about engaging in something that's unexpected, right? So if we think about a reflection of the natural world in ourselves, there's kind of 2 aspects of it. There's, is the image coming to me without being impeded by something on top of it? This would be like the cultural norms. And is it then being reflected back out? And in this case, is it being reflected back out in such a way that's more accepting, that is more open to the newness? Or is it something that's more about, how do I control or manage? Is part of the ideas that are coming up here. So this idea of cleaning it then is we're trying to get a clearer perspective on the reality, as well as how we're reflecting from ourselves back. Is that perception of reality triggering us an attempt to try and control and manipulate, or is it something that's more open to the newness and you know, kind of recognizing the kind of, if we think, bring in more kind of the feminine traits that come with that yin, you know, this kind of, there's this generative process of nature where things are constantly changing, things are coming in and going out. Can we accept it more in that direction? So I'll kind of see what you guys are thinking about this part here too. Do you like the idea of mirrors, kind of a metaphor for talking about this?
Jim, is the, oh, go ahead, Martin.
Oh, go ahead, sure.
No, I was just going to say, is the mirror kind of what they're getting at here? Is it reality versus our kind of interpretation or version of reality? Is that kind of what they're talking about? Like the natural world versus our interpretation of the natural world? Is that what this is getting at?
Yeah. So the blemishes, or the things that they're trying to clear from the mirror, would be those layers on top of things. That would be things that we've learned culturally and you know, tradition, family, whatever, different ways that impede the way that we both see and reflect what's happening in the world around us.
Like if you were to see a piece of bacon, to me, that would be delicious. I would be happy to see that. But for other people, that might be, oh my gosh, taboo, you can't eat that. So it would be reality versus the cultural or other layers on top of reality. Would that be an app? Is that true? Is that right?
So taking something like bacon, and what is our response to it? There's a number of different layers here that are going to be kind of fun to digest, so to speak.
Nice.
So the idea of, first, if it's just simply a mirror, then we're seeing the bacon and we see bacon, right? There's not a judgment about, is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Is this something I'm supposed to eat or not eat? The initial just reflecting reality is there's a piece of bacon, right? Then there's the additional kind of layers that come on top of this. Some of this is going to be natural spontaneity. So let's say you grow up in a culture where it's okay to eat pig and you've had experience of eating bacon and you like it, then it's going to trigger more of these kind of spontaneous, things like, maybe my mouth's going to water and I didn't have to actually try to get it to do that. It just does it, right? It's a spontaneous action. And I'm going to, have different spontaneous reactions as I engage in eating it. But there could be different cultural stuff on top of that, right? So maybe I come from a Jewish background where there's a long held tradition that we don't eat pig or have anything to do with pigs in that regard. And it's going to be perceived in an entirely different way. Where the Taoists would come in, or it could be something too where somebody's chosen to become a vegetarian, and let's say maybe they're an ethical vegetarian where the reason that they don't eat meat is because they're concerned about hurting other sentient life, and that's going to have a very profound impact on how they look at something like slaughtered animals for human consumption. So all these different ways of looking at it, the Taoists would say we need to understand where do they come from. If I'm an ethical vegetarian, that's fine. Why am I that way? But I need to remember that at first, it's just a piece of bacon, right? A piece of meat. Second is the evaluation. And that evaluation, if we're not confusing it with an objective reality that this is something that just is universally true, but in fact is a way of looking at things that I've adopted, then I can continue to have more of an accurate perception of my interpretation of the bacon. So it's really kind of like the separation. It's not to say that you're going to get to this point where you look at bacon and it's neutral, right? It's okay that it's getting you going in one direction or the other. It's just wanting to separate the reflection part from the evaluation part so that we can continue to evaluate the evaluation.
And the Taoists would say that's perfectly fine. Just be aware of the fact that here's reality and here are your kind of interpretations on reality. Just know the difference, be able to spot the difference.
And the one additional piece they probably would add to that is the question of, is our chosen evaluation in keeping with the natural way of things, the Tao, right? If our inclination beyond just the reflection is something that is trying to act against nature, then they would suggest that maybe that's not the best thing because we might be, hitting our head against the wall. So that would be, let's say, what would be a good example here?
That'd be kind of a loaded question. The Taoists are like, you don't eat bacon, but why are you Jewish? Wow.
Well,
I mean, that's kind of a loaded question. Like, it's going to take some time to unpack that.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily, the direction we want to take it right now, but we could say, let's assume we'll go back in history a little bit in the United States where it was feared that saturated fats were something that was bad for cardiovascular health. If you haven't kept up on this whole thought process, the idea of saturated fat being bad for you has completely reversed to where it's a very almost like deficient nutrients now that we have suffered from in terms of the effects of it on our bodies. So let's go back in time to when we thought it was a bad thing, right? So we might look at that bacon, but have this vision of, oh, this tastes really good and I really want it. If our conception of the world was true, that saturated fat was bad for you, then the Taoist might say something, well, is it good to desire something that's not good for you, right? And that could be all sorts of kinds of things that we could talk about. But this would be one of the ways that they would have that additional evaluation on top of our evaluation to say, how does this line up with the way of things? Is this working with that, or is it working against it? Is it allowing the flow to keep happening, or are you creating a blockage? Is it becoming obstructed? So again, the Taoists aren't saying that there isn't any evaluation. Obviously, they have this evaluation that they're doing with everything, where they're asking the question, does this match up with the way of Tao? And if not, then should you be doing it? Does that kind of help in terms of thinking about those different layers of perception?
Definitely. Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. Martin, were you going to ask something? Caught you with your mouth full, sorry.
No, sorry. So I actually wondered, because Josiah has a very good point in terms of the evaluation, and I wonder if ever Taoism says this is the right way versus all of those are wrong. I know what is wrong, but I can't tell you what the right way is, because even by saying that, that's adding an additional layer away from the natural level. That is this way of thinking, whether we want to call it religion or theological path, is still a social construct that may not necessarily be a good one. Coming back to the horse and some with a broken leg and army and stuff, and the we'll see kind of approach, it almost feels that everything would be, well, we don't know yet. We'll see if it's going to be good or bad. We don't know if this is aligned with the way, or it's actually working against it. Because as we change our mind, as we have new observations, as Bacon being an example, we may be just changing the way we look at things. If you have new learnings that change our perspectives, that change a lot of things, and I would imagine that this would still apply to the goodness and badness of that particular effect. That even something that we consider bad today may actually be good tomorrow. Maybe the social decision that or ethical decision to not eat other sentient beings leads to a decline in humanity, because we need some proteins from that are essential for survival eventually, long term, or whatever else it may be. It just feels like this is always going to be more about questioning than necessarily saying this is good or bad. Does that make sense? Am I becoming too theological?
No, and this is good, because I think that this is probably the number one reason why this classical Taoist perspective appeals to me in particular. Because as a naturalist, it's what I would be trying to cultivate in terms of that second nature is this ability to have my beliefs influenced by the best available knowledge that I have, right? And the ability to have that change based off of new information. So like the idea about saturated fats, it's very hard for people to shift their position on that depending on how invested they are in a particular way of thinking about it prior to that new information, right? Some people, it's going to be like, oh, here we go again. We're just changing some kind of dietary, observation. Other people are going to be, embracing it because they're like, man, I love bacon. This is great. I'm glad to hear this news. And other people are going to be like, oh no, this is just going to like make it so much harder for me to talk to people about vegetarianism. It's like our stances make it difficult for us to incorporate new information. And so part of, if there's a basic stance that the Taoists are trying to say, is that we need to consistently work on having a clear perspective so that we're not recognize when we're finding ourselves acting as though we're invested in a particular way of thinking about things, so that we can be more receptive In this case, the dark mirror as opposed to the light mirror. So the light mirror, if it was the yang, it's more about how do we use, how do we control, how do we manipulate? Whereas on the dark side, it's trying to say, how am I more open to new ideas and new things and new ways of experiencing the world? So that would be the point where the conclusion is there is a way that everything functions. We can see that there's these patterns, and you can't not do the patterns. The patterns are just built into the fabric of everything. Like we talked about, like gravity is a pattern, and it doesn't matter if you don't like it, doesn't matter if you're ignorant of it. It's the way it is, and you can either figure out how to work with it or you're going to fail. Right. And so that would be kind of like their baseline, is to say, okay, if there's these patterns in the way things are in the world, our goal is, how do we recognize those? How do we see them to begin with? So that means we've got to take any particular blinders off that we can. And then once we see them, how do we evaluate the way we be in the world so that we are in harmony with, or working well, harmony, I guess, is just the right word, right? That we want to bring our actions into alignment with how those natural processes work, or we're going to find ourselves, hitting our head against the wall. But in any particular situation, we don't necessarily have all the information, so we can't come to a final conclusion of certainty about almost anything, right? We might have a great deal of certainty, but it's never going to be like 100%. Or to use the Bayesian reasoning logic, it's never 100%. It's always slightly less. And there might be where we have a great deal of confidence. So if we're talking again about gravity, technically, it's still what's called a theory. But we have a great deal of confidence in that theory because of the experience, right? It's going to take a lot to get somebody to kind of overthrow the idea of gravity, because there's so many different ways of looking at it and testing it, and observation and consensually validatable information, that there's good reason to have a strong Bayesian reasoning, in the sense that it is most likely along the right track. However, we don't want to go to that 100%, because then if something does come that allows us to look at this differently, we're not going to be able to see it. So certainty becomes problematic. But they would have kind of some certainty around the idea that there are these patterns, and that we're going to be better off if we work in conjunction with the patterns as opposed to against them.
Jim, the way I kind of approach this concept is that you have to kind of make your decisions based on the information you have at the time. Do the best you can with the information that you have. Things might change. Definitely societally, things can change. But you just kind of have to, the Taoists, I think, would say you kind of have to go with the flow. Just kind of take what you have and what you know and what you've experienced, and try to make the best possible move you can. Recognizing the fact that that may in fact be the wrong move, or that move may change, but at the time, given the knowledge that you have, this was the right move.
Yeah.
I really like that. Just thought that was really good. Sorry, Jim. I want to put something, maybe push back, but
yeah,
throw it at you, especially when you said about the things that you know so far, and how would that apply when you have a person that says an Earth is round-ish, and person that says Earth is flat?
Mm-hmm.
There, as probably there is a lot of certainty on both sides, and how would Taoism look into it from the perspective of they would probably both be about the same-ish level of certainty in the objective manner, and they would have this lot of confidence that this is the way it is. But would Taoism at some point here say you're wrong and you're right, or would it be just like, hey, you both are on the right path of having as best information as you use your information as best as you can? You're just interpreting it differently, both of you, and you're using different experiences to justify your positions or to support your positions. And if we were to say that there is no one objective way to disprove one or the other, which is bonkers to me, but how would that kind of play out in this perspective of Taoism?
Yeah. Well, my suspicion is that when things are uncertain, they're uncertain, and we don't want to claim certainty, right? There, I think, would also be, like, if we're taking that specific example about a flat Earth situation versus a spherical planet, you know, how do we look at the information that's causing us to get there? Because from an experiential perspective, you know, I'm standing outside and doesn't feel like, you know, the ground's moving, doesn't feel like I'm spinning through space. And it definitely looks like the sun is rising and setting, right? As much as I might intellectually have a very different conception, my actual experience is very much one way. And I cannot, as much as I know otherwise intellectually, it doesn't, there's no way to avoid the sensation, the experience of it, right? So you can have the different things that are taken as evidence can be used to have greater weight. So if somebody is much more about what is my personal experience for making the decision, then they've got a lot of weight on their side, because it absolutely feels like the experience of going outside is that, you know, it's basically flat, you know, and it's not moving. And, you know, the sun and moon and stars are all moving, right? So if that's where the weight for your decision making comes from, then obviously there's a ton of weight there. But if you've got another way that you're evaluating my perception, you know, recognizing that, you know, a person from across the room is looking at me different than I'm looking at them, then how do I get outside of the limitations of my personal perspective in order to check or challenge what I think is there? This is where the idea of consensually validatable information comes into play. Then there might be other tools that we use to try and get around the limitations of my personal perception. And besides, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Jim. When you're, I just make a comment when you finish.
Yeah. So, you know, there's a lot of the limitations there. In addition to just my point of perspective, there's also, you know, the fact that my eyes don't see all the colors that are out there, that my ears don't hear all the sounds that are out there, you know, and so on. So if there are ways that we can detect and see and measure these things that can be validated by other people independently, then for people who value that level of information for making their decision, that's going to have higher weight than necessarily what my personal perception is, because I'm going to see my personal perception as limited. So there's kind of a fundamental shift at the beginning of, you know, what counts as information that is at the root of, I think, some of those kinds of problems, where you're not necessarily agreed upon what counts as information in evaluating something. And I don't know if there's an easy solution to that other than to just continue to be in dialogue.
Like the way you're saying. Thank you. Yeah, Rob.
I was going to say there are those who argue for different kinds of truth besides the Trump supporters. You know, there is an argument some would make for what's, I think, called the phenomenological truth. In other words, it appears that way. So in the sense that it appears that way, it's true. So I suppose you could apply that to the Earth debate. You know, there are other things you could apply it to. If you look at a rabbit, looks like it's chewing a cud, but we know scientifically it's not. But it looks that way. So we could say it's phenomenologically true.
Yeah, and that's the point I was bringing up in terms of that personal experience is another way of talking about that would be the phenomenologically, right? So the phenomenon of being outside as a human is that it appears that the Earth is flat and not moving, and that the sun, moon, and stars are all moving, right? So that would be the phenomenological perspective. And yeah, absolutely, Rob. Well, we did not get through this chapter yet again, so we'll have to pick this up next week. But I think this was some good discussion on this part. We've got a couple minutes left, so we'll see if there's any parting thoughts or questions before we go our ways.
I also would have one more. The mirror and the blemishes and how we observe things. Misunderstood, or maybe I didn't get the right message from that. But to me, it sounded a lot like Schrodinger's cat. Like it's about, the fact that I'm observing some symptoms. The observation itself is impacting the outcomes. Just like in the quantum world, like just by measuring the quantum particles, we are affecting them and therefore changing the outcome of those measurements. Is that right kind of a flavor to this mirror analogy?
Well, obviously we're bringing a lot of modern day questions about epistemology. What can we know that is maybe not the same kinds of questions they were asking. But I would say in general, the point is we want to have as uncluttered of a view as possible. And so in a modern day sense, we might recognize more of the fact that, I'm limited in what my physical senses can actually perceive. And there's a lot of stuff I got to get around, right? That I got to get past those limitations. I think for the Taoists, they're basically recognizing these different perspectives exist, and how can we be certain that any one of them is right? And there's also the question of time and how things continuously flow from good to bad, right? Or not good to bad, but they go from one extreme to the other extreme, and they're constantly on the move. So the guy with the farmer and the horse that you brought up earlier, he can't make that evaluative judgment that, yep, this is a good thing or this is a bad thing, because we don't know the end of the story yet. And really the story doesn't ever end. And so how can we ever draw a conclusion? There's that part of it, but we can more accurately reflect what's happening in the moment. And then how do we respond to that in more of a direct way, recognizing that there's a lot of these filters that are in between perception and reaction that we have to take account of.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for expanding on that.
Yeah. I mean, the whole thing with Schrodinger's cat is fascinating when we're thinking about everything being one thing, because really at the root of that problem, and if you're not familiar with the metaphor, there was a physicist that was trying to illustrate a problem of indeterminacy within the quantum realm, and he brought up this example of a cat that was stuck in this box, and it was a device in there that had some type of atomic decay that would trigger whether or not a poison was released and the cat was dead or the cat would be alive. And you wouldn't know until you opened the box. And the argument was, at the quantum level, if you had that same kind of scenario, that they would argue for a superposition, that the cat was both alive and dead at the same time. That's one interpretation. More of the Copenhagen interpretation, there's a relational interpretation of quantum mechanics that say, well, no, the cat is only in one state at any one particular time. He's just we're blocked from having access to it. But then, as Martin said, the act of looking impacts it, because there is no view from outside. We're all in that same system. So there's no way to observe the system without using the system. And in fact, in doing so, you impact it. So again, we're all part of this larger whole, and everything impacts everything else, and everything is correlative in terms of how it takes on different attributes and whatnot in the world. So anyway, long, fun discussion today, but we do need to bring it to a close. I'm going to have to close this out. So I want to thank you all for joining us today. And if you're watching this and like to join, you can go to www.kinshipcafe.cafe in order to sign up for the email and get your link. And we'd love to have you here. We'll see everybody next time.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Jim.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.